So I'm going to say hello to everybody. Good morning, good evening, whatever it happens to be, because I know we are worldwide and from many, many different time zones. But here in Dublin, where I'm based, it is 7 p.m. and it's been a beautiful summer's day. I hope everybody else has been having a nice weather and good weather for you. Um, this evening, we are joined by Lisa Langell. And Lisa is joining us from Arizona. She is a nature photographer and she's been interested in photography and birding since a very young age. She said here it's 8 years of age. So that's a long, well, I don't say it's a long time ago, but it's a very, very young age indeed. Um, but she has her own business, Lisa Langell Photography, and she's been doing that since 2010. But many other interesting things as part of her career before that, which I'm sure she'll mention as she goes through this evening. But the most important bit is that Lisa loves creating nature photographer and art inspired by her background in psychology and design. Um, when, as well as doing photography, she also teaches and organizes workshops. And she was just telling me that she's just returned from 5 weeks in Alaska, running various different workshops up there. Um, and I know that's part of the topic that she's going to be presenting to us tonight about our bears in Alaska, as well as a very interesting uh, thing joined on to that, which is Cowboys in Arizona. So we're all looking forward to that. Um, as I said, those are her interests. And through all of that, she's won numerous awards for her photography. She's been published in many different magazines, including Outdoor Photographer, Images Arizona, Arizona Highways, and she's an image master for Tamron in the Americas, as well as being an ambassador for Photo Pro tripods, and she judges for View Big. So I beg your pardon, View Bug. Um, so I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to ask Nisa to unmute herself. She can share her screen and away we go. But just to remind everybody before we do that, that if you have any questions that you want pass on to Lisa, please type them into the chat. And at the end, I'll pass those on to Lisa. So I'm going to say, sit back, buckle your seat belts and enjoy the presentation. Lisa, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you everyone for being here with me tonight. I really appreciate it. And this is a little bit of a different type of presentation for me. Usually when I present to a camera club or photography group, I'm very instructional, right? I'm going to teach you this skill and we're going to do things this way and, help you along with your photography. I'm going to introduce some skills and some tips, but I was specifically asked to just talk more about two things that don't go together, but honestly are near and dear to my heart. So they do go together in that way, and that is bears in Alaska. And I do a lot more than bears, but everyone's always so curious about the bears. So I'm going to talk a little bit about bears, a little bit about just the species itself that we're going to photograph up there, where you can photograph them, and a variety of things that I think will help you, whether or not you go on my tour, someone else's tour. This is not designed to be an infomercial. I really just want to talk to you about the bears themselves in Alaska. But on my tours, we do way more than just bears. It's the most diverse tour you actually can get in Alaska. So I'm excited about that, but we're going to focus on the bears. And then I'm going to probably give you whiplash with the transition. We're going to go to talk about cowboys in in Arizona. And, the Wild West is something that is nostalgic. It is definitely, something that people are passionate about photographing, crave to photograph, but it's wasting away. It is gradually dissolving as automaticity, we have technology, machinery, and so forth, start to kind of erode away some of the tradition. So I'm going to talk about a private ranch that we use at our workshop, and a little bit about the history of these cowboys and the ranch, and it is really that nostalgia that people crave, but it's also a real live working ranch, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. So I hope that'll be exciting for you. I always welcome questions. You can type them in the chat window. I will answer them as I can in the presentation, but largely I'll hold some of those for the end as well. And I probably have more content than we do time, so occasionally I might skip over some things, but if you have a question or anything, I don't mind answering that. But I want to try to be respectful of the time. So I'm going to actually start with Alaska first. We are going in alphabetical order here. But I want to talk about your summer destinations. You can go to Alaska anytime, but summer is typically when people go because it's not brutally cold. There's actually more daylight. There's plenty of daylight, sometimes too much. And all of the wildlife, the birds have migrated up there. The bears are out. Everything is just very fun and active. That said, Alaska has something for every season, but you really have to know what you're doing when you go there. And even in the summer, for folks who haven't been to Alaska, including myself before I went, I've been there over 60 times now. My first trip was in 2006. I really didn't know what to expect. And I kind of thought that moose and bears and things are, around every corner, and it's sort of like a big outdoor zoo. Maybe not that simplistic of a view, but I really thought it was no problem to find the wildlife. It actually is, it's there, but you really have to know where to expect to see these things, where they tend to hang out and where they don't. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. And specifically, we're going to talk about the bears here. But just a little about me. I have traveled to Alaska. This says over 48 times. It's probably closer to 60 now. I probably wrote that a little while ago and didn't update that, but I have been there literally more times than I can count at this point. I've loved photography, as Paul said, since I was 8. I've been a full-time professional photographer, self-sustaining since 2015, part-time since 2010, a photographer and a birder since I was 8 years old. So photography is in my blood. I love it. Can't ever wait to get back to Alaska. So here's a map of Alaska for those of you who, I'm sure you probably know where this is, but this is in the upper northwest corner of
Sorry,
our.
Lisa.
Oh,
Sorry, I beg your
yes,
pardon. You
yes.
haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh, weird. I thought I did. Hold on. Thank you for letting me know that. Let me
Okay,
try that again. Sorry, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
perfect. There we
Okay,
go.
perfect.
Yes.
Sorry about that. I guess it didn't take. Okay, so you didn't miss much. There's me. And there was the cover slide. I'm not going to bring that up again, but I want to talk a little bit about where we are going. So in Alaska, which is way up in the northwest corner of the universe for the rest of us down here in the continental United States, this was a pretty good deal, right? We acquired Alaska from Russia, and it honestly was probably the best purchase the US has ever made. It is lovely. It's amazing. It's huge. It is so incredibly compelling. I can't tell you other than to say when I went the first time, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, I went not knowing what to expect and thinking it would have been my only time to go to Alaska. I actually went for work years ago for another company that I worked for prior to my career as a photographer. And I'm saying this, it captures your soul and it just doesn't leave. And you go thinking you might go once and then you find yourself going twice and 3 times and more. I have people every summer on my workshops that have come in years past, and we always switch things up a little bit. And so they come back for more. They just can't get enough. Then they stay on and they go on their own, and then they come back with relatives. And it's just a very addictive place in a really healthy way. So this is where we're headed. I live down here in Arizona. By the way, if I wanted to drive up here, if I didn't stop to do anything, it takes about 68 hours to get to this area of Alaska where I do most of my workshops from Arizona. So 68 hours of driving hard to get there. So I fly. Now, Alaska has a lot of land and not a lot of population. There's about 800,000 people that live across Alaska. Many of them are also Native Alaskans, and they'll be spread out among all of these villages throughout Alaska, and still keeping to some of their traditional ways and blending modern culture. But this is the primary area where most people live, other than down off the page here in Juneau, Alaska, down in the Panhandle, Sitka, and some other smaller little villages down there. But if you're going to fly to Alaska and drive, you get the most bang for your buck by flying to Anchorage, and you can drive pretty much anywhere in this region right here, give or take. And so here are the three main arteries from up to Fairbanks, down into the Kenai Peninsula, both on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side of the peninsula. You can drive all the way up to Fairbanks. And if you have courage and a good car, you can drive another 400 and some miles on the Dalton Highway all the way up to Prudhoe Bay, where there's a lot of oil work happening up here. It's a dirt road, goes through some incredible scenery. And I have been both to Prudhoe Bay and up into, it used to be called Barrow. Now they've switched it back to a Native Alaskan name. So, and I can't even pronounce it, so just forgive me. But these areas are just beautiful. But you can go to some other towns and they'll have local roadways, but you cannot literally, other than taking a dirt road up here, get to any of these other areas by driving. You really have to fly in or boat in, depending on where it is. I really love this area down here. This is where I spend my time in my tours because it crosses against two different biomes. You have the ocean, you have land, you have mountain, you have tundra, you have taiga, you have flatlands and meadows and everything in between. It's a really diverse area, and they actually call this Little Alaska because there is so much diversity. Almost every species in Alaska can be found in this area if you know where to look. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some signature species, which primarily we're going to focus on the bears today, a little bit of some tour and travel tips, photo tips, and so forth. But starting off with the bears, these are just such awesome creatures. I'm really excited to be able to share my knowledge with you. I want to talk a little bit about photo tips as well, but I want to talk certainly about how to find these guys and where you got to go and what you have to do. And just a little tip, it's not easy. It's not just driving down the road and seeing, brown bears. There's a little more work to it than that. But when you get there, you can capture those iconic, bears with the salmon. This is in Katmai National Park. If anybody has seen that classic picture by Thomas Mangelson or many similar images that people have taken over the years, that was in this particular park, Katmai National Park. And this is at a specific area called Brooks Falls. We'll come back to that momentarily. But you can get some epic shots. This one is no light, not cropped, full frame. You can really get some good stuff if you've got a long lens and some good access to bears and light. And I love to do creative things too. So this is a little bit more of a vintage style, a little bit more painterly, a little bit of Photoshop art with this too, just to soften it up and make it work well for people on the wall. When they hang images on the wall, many times people want a little different vibe and aesthetic than they do for pictures going in a magazine or calendar. And I won't get into all of that today, but I love to do things that really work well in people's homes. And, a bear with a salmon in its mouth typically isn't something people want to put in their living room, too much gore and blood and guts, but something like this where they're clam digging, a little bit more softer and palatable for the wall. But this was just taken a couple weeks ago. I was out at Lake Clark National Park, which is another wonderful area for bears. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But these two were running because there was a boar, which is a male bear. Bears are related to pigs somewhere way up in the chain of the genus and species. And so females are called sows, males are called boars. And there was a boar way down the beach. And some people say this is true. Some people say it is not true. I've talked to experts on both sides, but I have seen boars chase females and tree their cubs. And many times boars reportedly have killed cubs in order to make the sow go back into estrus because the boar wants to breed. It's not because it's not his own kin that she has. She will keep these bears for 2 years. And on the 3rd year, they're kicked out of the den. But until then, the bear does not go into estrus until that 2-year cycle is over, and the boar really likes to breed. So that's always a danger. So these two were running down the beach, and I happened to capture them literally just a couple weeks ago. But there is a little bit about bears that people don't know. Many people don't know. So the name Ursus arctos, is the brown bear, and it resides in coastal Alaska. So there's often a lot of confusion. What's a grizzly bear? What's a brown bear? What's a black bear? Because some black bears can be brown. Some grizzly bears can look very white, almost as white as a polar bear. And then what's brown bear? And so brown bears are coastal. Grizzly bears have the same DNA, same thing. It's a bear. But grizzlies tend to live in interior Alaska, within about 100 to 150 miles from the coast. And that's because coastal brown bears have different feeding patterns. They tend to feed on salmon, and the salmon go up these tributaries all along the coast. And those tributaries are great migration areas for the salmon. And the bears, of course, feed on the salmon almost exclusively in the summertime. Sans, some sedges and clams, and occasionally some other things. But by and large, the grizzly bears are interior bears. They feed on mammals and berries and so forth. And coastal bears feed along the coast. And they look different. This is a grizzly bear. They have more silver tips on their fur. These are coastal brown bears. They are much bigger, and they primarily feed on salmon. And they come in an array of colors from deep dark chocolate brown all the way up to almost blonde, almost white. And then there's black bear, and black bears don't live in the upper third of Alaska. It's primarily because it's all tundra up here, not really any trees anymore, but they live down in these areas of Alaska. And of course, here's a black bear. We probably all know what those look like, but they are a little bit different. They're smaller. They predominantly feed on mammals and berries, and they do feed on salmon as well when it's available, but different DNA. But these are the same species. Polar bear are different. However, up in this northern area of Alaska, we're starting to see where polar bears and grizzly bears or coastal bears are interbreeding, and they're called pizzlies, Pizzly, pizzly bears. So half polar bear, half grizzly bears. I have not personally seen one, but they're starting to see that hybrid type of bear in the northern part of Alaska. It's not known why for sure, but it's potentially climate change as things change with what food is available and where the bears are living. We're starting to see that. So here are some coastal brown bears, and brown bears definitely have this big hump on their back at the shoulder, and black bears tend not to have that so much. And then we have 3 cubs here. Cubs are typically, for a sow, she will have 2 to 3 cubs. Every once in a while, she'll have 4. She also, of course, can have 1. And often when you see the cubs, the mortality rate for cubs is pretty high, at least 35%. So sometimes you'll see a sow with 3 cubs one week, and you'll see her again the next week, and she might only have 2 or 1. And that's just nature, unfortunately. But this is a sow with her 3 cubs. And this is in Lake Clark National Park. So as we go along and you want to look at bears, it's so interesting. My clients came to Alaska this year, and they said, oh, I had several people say this to me. Oh, I met someone at the airport, or I met someone on the shuttle bus, or wherever they happen to meet someone in their travels to Alaska. And the conversation of photographing bears came up. And the people that they were talking to, fellow tourists, travelers, locals, whatever, they're like, oh, you're not going to find bears in June. They're not around until August. Well, That is not true, but unfortunately, these people were just miseducated on where to find these bears and when. So bears are big migrators. They don't stay in one place. They go where the food is, right? Just like humans tend to go where the money is, bears go where the food is. And bears tend to den up high up in the mountains. And so it's freezing cold up there. It's snowy, it's icy, all those things. And then as that starts to melt, they come out of their dens, and the sows will come out with their cubs and start working their way down to more the lower levels where the meadows are, where sedge meadows are, where clams are, and that food is already active, right? That grass is already growing, because by the time it gets, melty up at the higher areas, the lower areas are well underway for summer growing season. So they'll exit their dens in May and early June. They're thinner then. That also surprises people that, you don't see these big roly-poly bears. But they clam dig, they forage on the sedges, and the sedge grasses, which I have some photos of in a minute, are very nutrient rich, very protein rich, and that's an extremely important food source for them. But there are none to maybe very few salmon that start to come in starting in mid-June. But mid-May to early June, they're really feeding on sedges and clams at that point. Very little else. But then as we move into mid-June through August, the salmon runs start to kick in, and the salmon runs literally have a schedule. And these salmon, certain species come in at certain times, and there might be one run of them, there might be two, but salmon, sockeye salmon, which is one of the most prevalent kinds, for example, they have a run in mid-June and they have another run in July, and all of these salmon come in a short amount of time and just flood the rivers, and the bears have a field day. And when that actually happens does vary by location. So the things further upstream take a lot longer for the salmon to get there than things closer to the coast. The first year cubs, or cubs of the year, are growing tremendously. They're just little like stuffed animals their first year in the beginning, but they grow a ton. And then as August starts to happen, you get into the fireweed, which is this beautiful pink plant that grows everywhere up there. And those bears enter into what we call a hyperphagia state. That is when they literally hyperfeed. They are nonstop feeding all day long, all night long. They don't stop. They're trying to put on all that weight so they can go back to their dens in the wintertime. And then by September and October, the hyperphage continues into late September and early October, and they start beginning to den up sometime in October. And here's a little fun fact that I don't think most people know, because we've been told wrong. I've heard it in schools, I've read about it in papers online, but this is something I want you to be able to rewrite your knowledge on about bears. So bears actually don't hibernate. And in fact, bears in the southern US, they don't even den. They are out 365 days of the year doing their thing. But the bears in the north don't actually hibernate. They go into what's called torpor, which is somewhat slower of a metabolistic state for them, and they are sleeping, but they can wake up from time to time and go about their normal business. Their bodies don't quite shut down the way, a hummingbird does or certain mammals do. This torpor is not hibernation. It's a different physical state. But so often we've been told bears hibernate, and that isn't quite true. It's like hibernation light, if you will, or like a deep sleep, but not hibernation where their bodies actually really shut down most of their mechanisms. So when we photograph these bears, and here's an example of these sedges that they feed on, highly rich in protein, it's just a wonderful opportunity. People often think these bears are, go eat the salmon, go do all these crazy things at just salmon time. But oh, the bears on the meadows with the sedges are so beautiful. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. There are about 30,000 brown bears that live in Alaska. Alaska contains 98% of the U.S. brown bear population and 70% of North America's entire population of bears. And brown bears have more of an acute sense of smell than even dogs, and they can run up to 40 miles an hour. So you could even be the fastest person in your group, and you still can't outrun a bear. But some planning tips for you. The salmon runs vary by location, so you really need to know where you want to go. And if you want to photograph bears with the salmon, when those runs happen. And it is sometimes climate dependent. I've had years where the salmon has run late. I've had years where they've run early. It's not like a clock, but it's close. And so you do want to know that to plan your trip if you want photographing bears with salmon. The weather is the driest in June. You're going to have the least rain, typically, although last year was an exception, but typically weather is the driest in June, and the bears are fattest in September and October. And there's plenty of options for tours out there. Yes, I am one of them, but there's really a lot of different options to go and see bears, whether you want to go for an afternoon or, 10 days, you can certainly go. For a afternoon or a 1-day trip, which 1 day usually gets you about maybe anywhere from an hour, hour and a half up to maybe 4 or 5 hours with bears, and where you are may vary and how close they are may vary. But US, that usually runs around $1,600 or so. And that's because you have to take a small plane to go into these very remote areas. And they can usually take, depends on the plane, but anywhere from about 4 to 10 people. So it's expensive to go. It is not cheap. And you can find bears driving to them, but those options are very, very few and far between if you're flying into Anchorage. It's just, yes, there's bears, but to get any consistent quantity, you really need to go out to some of these remote locations. And some of them are more than 4,000 per day if you're staying at a lodge. So it's no cheap endeavor to do that. You want to book early. Those dates get quickly booked up. And 3 areas that you go to are Katmai National Park, Lake Clark National Park, and then Kodiak Island. And that's all for the brown bears. And they all have their own kind of timing, so you'll want to research it accordingly. And you can go to Denali National Park or in those regions for the grizzly bears, the interior bears. I'm going to focus today on Katmai and Lake Clark. And so here's another map, Joanne. I know you love maps, and so I love maps. So I wanted to give you an example of how big Lake Clark National Park is. So it covers a pretty wide territory. This is the Cook Inlet from Alaska. Anchorage is back over here. This is a massive, massive park. And some of the areas that we go are in these little coastal regions down here. That just has wonderful, wonderful opportunity for bears. And I'm going to just take a look at the chat questions real quick to see if there's anything that has come up that I can help answer. Let me see. All right, nothing yet. Perfect. Okay, so in late May through September would be a good time to go to Lake Clark, but where you go depends on what time of year. And so Lake Clark here is a little bit bigger. This is Tuxedni Bay. There are a couple waterways through here. There is actually 2 volcanoes in here. And then the other side of one of these volcanoes is Chinitna Bay. This, to me, is the best spot for May and early June. As the bears migrate for salmon streams, then getting up into these areas, Tuxedni Bay and up into some of the areas here are better options to go for bears in Lake Clark. And so my preference was, and still is, Lake Clark National Park and Lake Clark Wilderness Area. Those are truly some wonderful places to go. So I give that one the green light. You can also go to Katmai in mid-June through August. That's another national park. I put this in yellow because it has some concerns. First of all, a lot of it is slogging through mud. So if you like to get out of a plane and you like to kind of take long hikes with your gear, and depending on the tides and so forth, it can be really muddy or wet. But you can get some great shots. I would suggest Katmai. There is one option that is pretty physically easy, and that is Brooks Falls. But personally, I wouldn't go in July. There are so many people there that they put you in the onto viewing platforms, and you only get 20 to 30 minutes there before they usher you out and the next person in line gets to go. And so it's a very tight place to shoot in mid-June through August. September opens up, not as many tourists and fatter bears. So I give that one a yellow because I've been there and it's neat. It's also really hard to photograph. The bears are close, but because you're on these viewing platforms looking down, a lot of your shots can be kind of top down from a, perspective, and I don't particularly care for that. And then too, you have white waterfalls with dark wet bears. So the contrast and exposure is especially challenging. It doesn't matter what kind of light, overcast light, full sun, it is a challenge in most cases. And then there's the Kenai Peninsula, which is phenomenal for every other kind of wildlife. And that's why I spend my time here on the Kenai, because I'll do, puffins and murres and eagles, and sometimes we get black bear, and, moose and caribou and snowshoe hares, and on and on and on. We do all of these things in the Kenai Peninsula because it's so rich in other wildlife. But we fly to Lake Clark for the bears, and I really personally love Lake Clark. There is a couple of places if you do head to Alaska on your own. The Russian River in July, there's a salmon run that goes up there, and if you walk about 4 miles round trip, there's a waterfall, and sometimes there are bears there that you can photograph. So that would be a place that you could drive to and then hike to see the bears. There's also Skilak Lake, which, unless you have a boat, the lake itself is not very accessible, but there are some black bears on the north side of the lake driving in May and June, and some brown bears in August. But you have to hike on some trails. And me personally, I'm not a big fan of hiking on trails and surprising bears. I often go by boat or on the beach, and you just let the bears see you. And they're pretty far away and they can come much closer, but I've never, ever, ever felt in danger doing it that way. And we also have a bear guide who is there to help protect us. And then there's Seward, and there's a place called Bear Lake, and there's a fishing weir there where they harvest spawning salmon for their eggs and help the hatcheries keep the population of salmon going. And sometimes there are bears there in late summer. And then Portage Glacier also has a viewing platform where you may see black bears. So there's a few places on the Kenai, but you really have to know what you're doing and be there at the right time. Katmai is good, but can be tricky. And Lake Clark is, in my opinion, the best. There's also the Wildlife Conservation Center, which you can go to just outside of Anchorage, and they have bears in big open pens for, they are in captivity, but it is photographable if you want to do that. So my preference is Lake Clark, and anything from late May all the way through to September. Here's one picture of Lake Clark. This is Chiswick Island. And believe it or not, there's an old mining cabin up here, and it's just a beautiful area. That's one. And then this was an iPhone picture because I was in a plane, but this is Lake Clark National Park in Chinitna Bay. And these mud flats, when the tide goes out, are wonderful for bears clamming. And I'm not going to play the video because I know the internet is a little bit sketchy for some, so I'll leave that alone. But this is some of the sedge meadows where the bears are. And this is one of the best places to be. I just love it here. So I'm going to talk briefly about some tips, and I want to leave time for Cowboys as well. But everyone wants the close-up pictures of the bears, and I completely agree with you. It's wonderful. And one of the things with the bears that I love and that we can do for our clients with the tours that we do is we can typically get really close to the bears. And I know people are like, wait a minute, isn't that unsafe? Yada, yada. We can often get the closest when we're in a boat. So we're in small fishing boats, and we can saddle right up to areas where the bears are. They're kind of oblivious to us. They don't really care that we're there at all. And we can get some great close-up shots. That is in late June through September. In early June, I would still recommend going. We do Lake Clark on a beach, and I've gotten anywhere from about 10 feet to, 100 yards or more from bears. It just depends on where they want to go. But both of these areas, we do bring a bear guide, and I recommend you do the same. Don't just show up there for a variety of reasons. But I have never, ever, ever felt unsafe because the bears always know we're there. We're not surprising bears. We're not hiking down a trail. We're going to surprise a sow and cubs. We are there. They are there. They are used to seeing people, even though there's not many people there. They are used to seeing people, and they pretty much just go about their business unless you do something really obnoxious. So I have never felt threatened or unsafe, and I've done this countless times. I think I made 30 some bear trips just last year alone for my tours. We did tours all summer long. I've never felt unsafe ever. And here's, getting down low is another technique for these bears if you are on a beach. I love the low profile. So you can, crouch down low, get down there, wear waders so that you can kneel in the mud and kneel in the sand, but you can really get some nice low profile shots. So this is a boar, a big male bear, just walking by us like he had no cares in the world. Here's one swimming in Lake Clark Wilderness, one of my favorite shots. A lodge now has this on their business card, but this is an example of what you can get when you go by boat that you can't get any other way. It's just so much fun to do these different perspectives. And this is from Katmai. This is one of the few shots that you can get where the water wasn't too white and the bears weren't too dark and the light was soft enough, and with a little bit of Photoshop restoration to kind of bring up the darkness in the bears, a pretty decently lit shot. But keep in mind, Katmai can be pretty challenging if you go to Brooks Falls because of that light. And speaking of light on these bears, if you go on a sunny day, which, my hope is always for light overcast, but if you go on a sunny day, it can be really hard to deal with the dark fur and the light fur and have any kind of, beautiful contrast and light. So I recommend going in the morning, in the evening, or on overcast days to get your best light for bears, because it's very hard to expose so that your highlights aren't blown out and your shadows aren't clipped. So, you overexpose to lighten up the shadows, your highlights get blown out, and vice versa. So it's just a challenge. Often I've had to wait until a cloud goes by, or, try to look at my histogram. That is just something I do all the time to get those exposures so that you could maybe lift the shadows and tone down the highlights and even out that light a little bit. But just know that sunny days are going to be a trick if you're going in the middle of the day. And I say that for people that might be taking a day trip over. It can be challenging. So just be prepared. A polarizer doesn't help a ton, but you could try it and see. I mean, all light varies. I can't give a one size fits all example, but a polarizer could help. And then shutter speeds for the bears. If you're hand holding, minimum thousandth of a second if the bear's just standing there kind of grazing or doing nothing. And if you've got some action, 2500th of a second, because you just really want to freeze that action. Wide apertures for most shots with a one bear subject. Stop down if you want to include subjects at different planes or you want a sharper background. That's going to be helpful to you. But for the most part, I just shoot as wide open as I can. And ISO, I adjust accordingly. Obviously, keeping it lower is better. And then once you have your subject, adjust. Like, see how, if you pulled back on the shutter speed a little bit, can you still get a decent shot? Give yourself options. If the bear's just standing there grazing, play with your exposures. Try exposing before you have that perfect moment so that you kind of have it dialed in for you. And then I use a lot of exposure compensation, over or under exposing depending on the foreground, the background, and the subject. And of course, I always love bears with some flowers if you can get it. So, oops, sorry. I already covered that slide, but real quickly, one other thing that people find is that, gee, I go to photograph these bears, I've spent all this money and they are not close up today. And that happens. It's bears. None of us have control over where they are and or when they're going to show up. You can increase or decrease your odds by visiting more, or B, picking times when bears are at their peak for, salmon, but you still just don't know. It's a crapshoot. And so I try to tell people, instead of trying to crop to smithereens for a bear that you're photographing that's, a quarter mile away and is a dot, consider alternative compositions. I want you to find layers in your landscapes and use those. Consider using textures, like the texture that's in the scene, and amplifying that with the bear. Adding interesting aspect ratios are so critical. So this bear was quite far away, and at 600 millimeters, this was still as close as I could get on this particular day. But it was beautifully foggy with the morning light, a little bit of backlight. And I'm like, use it. This is a beautiful picture of a bear and its environment. This would be beautiful on the wall where you don't want, again, a close-up of a, bear eating a salmon. Think about pictures like this. Find a nice background. Find a nice light for that bear and use it. And it's okay that it's small in the frame. Is this a magazine photo? Absolutely not. It wouldn't jump off the page when you've got it, in a quarter-page ad, for example. Even a 2-page spread would be questionable. But for a home, it's ideal. Or, think about bears in the environment. So these two bears were in on this rocky outcrop, and they were just coming down this hill. And again, we were in a situation where you couldn't zoom in super close. But if you include that environment, not everything has to be the tight crop. Include more of that environment. Make it a beautiful landscape or an environmental shot with bears in it. I think it tells the story in a much better way sometimes, and is definitely an option you want to go with. This is the full frame picture. This was as close as we could get. I was shooting with 500 millimeters at that point. And I see a couple questions that have come in from Anha, I believe. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Anha Richter, excuse me. Do you need a license to photograph the bears? You do not, but you do need some type of, fee for the national parks. So when you go over there, they usually will charge you a fee if you go to Katmai and there's an office there. And if you're going with a guide or, a flight company, they usually charge it for you. And, for me, I also have to get permits. So if you're going with someone, you can ask, but that's usually taken care of. But there is a fee for the national parks, but you don't need a license to do so. You would need a license to hunt them. And in the national parks, those are typically preserved bears. No hunting is allowed, but there's other areas where there's hunting allowed. So again, just looking at wide aspect ratios and keeping to those types of things when you have a bear that's a little bit more distant. Here's another full frame picture. Not much going on. These bears were a little further away. This is just the shot out of the camera. But consider doing wider aspect ratios and closing in and telling more of the story. I think sometimes people forget that wide aspect ratios are really beautiful and another way to tell a story when your bears aren't super close to you. And even when the lighting is different. So this isn't quite a silhouette, it's a little bit backlit. It was in the evening about 11:30 at night. Keep in mind it's daylight a lot in Alaska, but I just loved the way this water gave this almost graphic look to it with the contrast. I just loved it. So there's lots of different ways that you can photograph the bears out there. And by the way, this is another wide aspect ratio. Or consider vertical. I love this sow. She was just posing for us perfectly. And consider high key options too. I specialize in high key, which is these light, bright, white backgrounds, very simplistic style. I love it for interiors, especially. It just works so well. But, go vertical. Consider getting the reflections or the foreground in. Do something high key when the light is bad for everything else. It really can work beautifully. Here's another key, but I didn't crop in tight. I let a lot of that foreground and this water ripple. He was walking in the tidal flats on a really gray day, and he was backlit. So it worked really well to overexpose and do a high key shot and keep it very minimalistic. This one as well. This one was just published in a book called Remembering Bears, which raises money to help support wildlife. But I waited forever. I'm running down the beach, trying to keep ahead of this sow and her cub until they finally walked in unison with the same legs at the same time. That took a while because this cub was so squirrely and wanted to do everything but walk. It was playing in the mud and playing with the clam and playing, running around mom. None of those shots were perfect. I finally got it. I probably walked a mile down the beach to get it, trying to follow them along the shore. And again, verticals, right? Those are certainly options. And so if you do go to Lake Clark National Park, multiple lodges and tour options by land and by boat are certainly available to you. Buyer beware. Some are better than others. Some are really good at taking your money and not necessarily doing what they say. Others are better. You just have to do your research. Of course, I welcome you to come with me, but wherever you go and however you get there, just do your research. But I love spring for clam digging. Everyone always says, I got to get a picture of a bear with a salmon in its mouth. And I'm like, okay, but there's a million of those. The clam digging on the mud flats can give you so many interesting reflections and poses and lights and action. The summer solstice, you have these long magic hours in June and July. And I mean, the magic hour can be like 3 hours long each end of your day. Use that for some beautiful light. There's lots of different lodges and options that you can go to that aren't as overrun with tourists as some other bear locations are. And by the way, I've talked about Katmai and Brooks Falls. There are other areas in Katmai you can go, but you will want to ask, depending on your physical ability, whether or not it requires lots of walking and carrying your gear through mud flats, because some mud flats are better than others, and a lot of them, it is work because your feet sink down and then you got to pull your feet up out of the muck and the suction. And I did it a few years ago to test out an area to see if I wanted to run a tour there. And I was like, no, my clients are not going to want to slog through all of that. So I tend to pick the physically easier places. But, if this sounds like something you want to do and you want to do something a little more challenging, go for it. Katmai is a great place for that, but just beware. It can be exhausting. I love the Lake Clark because of the good viewing options that we have, and it's pretty consistent. And we see plenty of bears. I would say 20 to 40 bears per day is what we'll see. Very rarely have I had fewer than 10. I think 1 year I had one, but in 12 years and well over 100 of these tours that I have done, I only had one day ever where we didn't see a bear. And we saw them flying in, but by the time we landed, they had moved on. So that's only one day out of countless tours that I've done. But to prepare, and I'm going to move on to Cowboys pretty quickly here, but to prepare, check on those tour options by land and by boat. Ask how much walking, what's the terrain, what footwear is needed. Sometimes they loan you footwear, sometimes you need to bring your own. How many people do you expect there in a day? How much shooting time do you get per day? What time do you go out? What time do you come back? And can, check that against sunrise and sunset. And then I also check the tide tables, because low tides are going to give you your best bears clamming and out on the mud flats like you see here. They don't do that at high tide. They do that at low tide, and especially during negative tides. So the tide is lower than the mean tide. So your tide tables are going to be a big help in your planning. And then if you go with us by boat, I mean, literally, we can get really darn close to these guys, and they could care less. This guy's photographing with his cell phone here. But this is, sometimes it does rain, so you have to be prepared, as we are. But you can get some pretty rewarding shots from not very far away at all. In fact, my group a week ago was here in this location, and they were shooting bears with a wide angle lens. So if that gives you, and very safely. So if that gives you any idea of what you can get. But again, and I try different things with the bears, vintage styles and just all kinds of different looks. But Lake Clark, plenty of bears, day and overnight trips available, a 60 to 90-minute flight from Anchorage, and it's shorter if you're from the Kenai Peninsula. So on that note, I'm just going to show you a couple more quick pictures of some bears from Lake Clark. They're just so much fun. I absolutely love them. All right. And then I am going to read to see if you have any questions, and I'm going to move quickly on to the Cowboys portion of this presentation. But does anybody have any questions right now as I switch over? All right, looks like I don't have any questions yet. Feel free and type any questions in the chat window. I'll send you a quick message. If anybody wants to join my newsletter, you are welcome to join that. It's free. It gives you tips and ideas and trips and other kinds of things. But I am going to switch over to Cowboys, and I'm going to try to make this pretty short because I know we are getting to the end of our time. But I felt like the bear information was the most important, because if you're going to go, you want to have some decent information to go on. And if you have questions that you're not answering, feel free and reach out to me after the webinar, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. And I'll put my email in the chat window. All right, there you go. All right, so I do this workshop called Magic of Cowboys, and this is not an infomercial. I just want to tell you how this got started. So I used to photograph in Arizona, both people and, of course, wildlife. And through a variety of serendipity and circumstances, I got to do a portrait shoot at this old bar in a mining town in Arizona, and it was a free teaching session, and I invited anybody that was in the bar to get their portrait done. And as a thank you, the bar actually put out a buffet of food for anybody that did it for free. So it was a real win-win thing. People got to learn, people got their photos taken, people got free food. I brought people into the bar. Like, it was all good. And from that, I met this cowboy there who happened to be there. And very long story, very short, I now have a Magic of Cowboys workshop. And it's always been something of interest to me. I've loved horses since I was a kid, but have never been able to have horses. And so when I got this opportunity, it grew like a little seed. And now it is this big, beautiful tree. And I just love all that I've learned about the Cowboys, cowboy lifestyle. And I say cowboys, I mean cowgirls too. But this whole ranch lifestyle, and it varies from place to place throughout the country. And I see a comment real quickly from Med Morchindi. It's a shame to present the bears in small format next to tourists and photographers. Okay, maybe my size wasn't appropriate. If you could clarify what you meant, if I could help you in some way, please let me know. There's only so much room on the page, so I'm doing the best I can. All right, so Magic of Cowboys. So this workshop evolved from a relationship, and a good friendship was developed with this cowboy. And I was like, hey, I'm a photographer. I really want to do something that takes wildlife photographers into the action and cowboy world, but also into a little bit the portrait world, because I tried as a photographer to do portraits, and I actually signed up to be a part of a co-op in a studio. I took classes from people. I went to little photo shoots and all these kinds of things at this location in Arizona. And all I found there was that I felt a little ostracized. I felt condescended a lot. A lot of the people that were there, no offense to anyone on this webinar, but at that location, it was predominantly older men who just wanted to photograph 19-year-old scantily clad women. And that just wasn't my vibe. And so I didn't feel like I was really learning anything. And I felt very judged. And, and I'm sensitive, as we all are. I don't want to, offend anybody. I always want to do the right thing. I want to make sure my photos are good and all that kind of stuff. And so I was really dismayed by the whole thing. I canceled my membership to the co-op. And I was like, I guess I'm just not a portrait photographer. But that's not like me. When I set my mind to something, I really want to do it. But I didn't want to do it in that environment. That environment was hostile for my learning. I wanted something more calming, more supportive, more, let's come as you are and we'll move you ahead, that kind of thing. And I wasn't getting that. And so from this relationship, I said, I want to do a cowboy workshop and I want to photograph people in their natural environment. We can bring in added lighting and all that if we want to, but I really want to do something that's fun and that will introduce wildlife photographers to a new skill set and help expand their current skill sets, and it'd be a lot of fun. So that's how this Magic of Cowboys started, and it has gone on let's see here, 7 years now. We've done this multiple workshops a year. It's been a lot of fun. And so that is why I do this workshop. I want people who hate photographing people to be a little more comfortable around it and also photograph all the other amazing things that we can do there. And I feel like the way we do it here, it just makes everyone feel so much more comfortable. And guess what? The Cowboys aren't 19-year-old scantily clad models who have a career modeling. They are people that are working hard at a ranch. They don't know how to pose. So when I teach you some basic posing techniques, they are not saying they're going, gee, photographer, you don't know what you're doing. They will take any advice and suggestions from you and happily do it. So it's this much less threatening kind of non intimidating environment. And that's what I love about this. And so we're at a real working cattle ranch that has longhorn cattle, as you can see. Longhorns, they're iconic, but most ranches don't have them because of the fact that longhorns don't ship well. Throwing a whole herd of longhorns into a cattle hauler, the longhorns are just going to damage each other. The shorter horned steers of various varieties are usually what ranches will pick for meat cattle. Longhorns tend to be used for rodeo or for their pelts when they're, older and have to be put down. But they're wonderful, kind cattle. And so a lot of ranches will have them, again, for rodeo work, or their pelts are sometimes sold when they are passed away. And this is Bonus. This is one of the steers. And this is actually with a cell phone years ago. So it isn't a super fancy camera, but it was just such a great pose of him. And it just shows these long horns. I mean, these horns can be 6 to 8 feet long. They're absolutely huge. And this is a working cattle ranch run by 2 women. We have Shelly, who owns it, and Jenna, who is the ranch manager. And personally, as a woman, I love that we have 2 women, strong women, running this ranch. And of course, there's male cowboys there too, and other cowgirls, but just 2 tremendous people. And so this is Shelly, that's Jenna. And one of the things that we do here is celebrate the culture of history of men and women cowboys and cowgirls over the years. We have reenactment actors that talk about cowboys from the 1800s, and we also photograph them. We have, and this was not staged. This was just, they had a chuck wagon and they took it out into the desert, and very coincidentally, everybody lined up like this, and we happened to photograph it, and I did it in a vintage style, but it truly looks like it could have come out of something from, the late 1800s or early 1900s. It's just such a fun and interesting atmosphere, and the location in the desert is a stunning one. And so I help photographers develop a variety of skills. And I'm going to talk about some of those skills that you can take with you as you go along here today. But one of the things that we like to teach is panning. And panning with a slow shutter can be incredibly challenging. It is not an easy thing to do, but one of the things that you have to do is you have to make sure that you shoot, at least for horses, and often for birds too, about 1/25th of a second to 1/30th of a second. And you also, and this is the hardest part, I suggest putting a grid, if you can see my hands, the tic-tac-toe grid, enable that on your camera. And keep, or maybe use a center box for your focus, either the 9-point, or some of them have a center zone, or a spot focus, although that's a little bit hard. You need to keep your subject in the same position in the frame the entire time. And that's hard because usually we're just happy to get the subject anywhere in the frame we can, and then we kind of crop a little bit to, get the right composition. In panning, where you get these slow shutters where the cowboy and horse look reasonably in focus and the legs are all blurry and the background is blurry and streaky. To do that, you have to keep the subject in exactly the same place in the frame as you shoot, as the horse goes by or the bird or whatever it is. So by putting that grid in there or using that focus point, as long as you keep that focus point in the same place on your subject, you won't get ghosting and you'll have this clarity. And that's one of the things we work on quite a bit on this workshop. And it extrapolates. It's not just cowboys, it's birds, it's bears, it's wildlife of any kind that's running. It's a sporting event, it's your kid playing soccer, anything that you want to do that you want to imply that movement, such as in a style of shot like this, requires slow shutter speeds. And it does vary a little bit by subject. The faster the subject, the slightly faster your shutter speed can be. Here's an example: cranes, egrets, herons, those about 1/15th to 1/25th of a subject. If you have ducks, it can be 1/30th to 1/50th of a second because they move so much faster. So you do have to adjust your shutter speed, but that is what's going to be necessary to keeping the subject in the same frame as you pan. And then you're also going to want to shoot on high speed continuous shutter and continuous focus, or on Canon, it's AI focus. Those two things are going to be critical for you to be able to get those shots. And I know this is just some tips. I could delve into it much deeper on another time or another webinar, but those are some things, and people don't realize you have to keep your subject, I've said it like 3-4 times already, in the exact same portion of the frame. So you have to track at the exact same speed that the subject is going and keep them in the same spot, or it won't work at all. Yes, I'm just discussing this picture. There's not additional text at this point. And then we get into silhouettes, which is another thing that I think is iconic for cowboy work and ranch work. And we do these every evening at the ranch. And the idea is to expose for the sky. So if you've never done a silhouette before, or you don't know why some turn out and some don't, first of all, you need high contrast. You need backlighting. It tends to work best if the light is low in the sky. As you can see here, it's almost sunset. And therefore, your subject isn't getting ambient light hardly at all. And if you expose for the sky, meaning that your exposure makes the sky look correct, not too bright, not too dark, or sometimes you can underexpose by maybe 1/3 of a stop or even 2/3 of a stop to get that. That tends to work well. But you need your shutter speed high enough so that you can freeze any action that's going on. And in this particular case, we also shot at f/16 so that we could get this nice burst of light through the legs. But this is a silhouette. And in silhouettes, you also want to make sure you see the feet. A lot of times I see photographs of anything, someone standing in a yard in a silhouette, or an animal, and the legs and feet are blending into the scenery behind it. So if I took this horse and I put it over here, its waist and feet are going to get lost. You're just going to see the upper half of the horse. That wouldn't look nearly as good as this separation that's given by the dust and the backlighting and then the feet on the ground. So this is a really low shot. I'm sitting at a very low level on a stool as the horse is running towards me. Here's another silhouette. Now this one is using those wide aspect ratios. And so you're getting a silhouette of this beautiful ranch, and we have horses climb up onto this hill with riders and they walk along, and you've got the saguaro cactus. And again, we're exposing for the sky, putting the horse in the brightest part of the sky and exposing for that sky so that the horse and the other elements go dark. We also have a lot of subjects that are not merging. My horse isn't merging with a saguaro. My horse isn't merging with the brush. We're waiting until it goes out into a clearing. No, you can't see the actual feet here, but there's very little that's missing, and you have separation with the legs and the belly. Those little things with a silhouette are so important. Separation contrast with the background against the foreground, the subject. And, you know, everything else tends to stand out. So you really want things that give your eyes something to hook onto. So all these saguaro cactus are something of interest for my eyes. Then you have a beautiful background. And then it was overcast a little bit. So you have these dark blue clouds. It just kind of frames up the subject. Here's another silhouette, again, low to the ground. Look at how I can see the feet down here in the action. Even the dog's feet I can see. And then we have this right over here. Now, I let this slide, but see how this horse merges a little bit with the background here, and it just doesn't completely tell the story. But given that everybody else here isn't merging, I can live with this because you know what these all are. These are horses. But if this was just on its own, I would not use this shot. If I had just my composition was just this rider, I would have asked him to move out into the road so that it was much cleaner of a shot. And then again, you're exposing for your sky so that you get that color and that light, and then this will go dark. And if you still need a little bit more darkness, you can underexpose by a stop or two. And I'm focused on the subject closest to me. Here's another one on that hill. We've got some rim light now, which is also beautiful and really interesting skies. So I didn't include much foreground. Typically silhouettes don't have a lot of foreground because it's just black, but you need something to anchor these pictures. And that sun just started to creep over the ridge. And this was shot with a 600 millimeter. And this one here, your eyes, by the way, with contrast, go to the brightest things first and then the darkest things. And so when we put those two things together, it's like a match made in heaven with silhouettes. It's one of the reasons why they are so compelling. So I have a little tail flick here that actually brings me right to the sun, and the sun is illuminating this beautiful area here. But notice how my eyes didn't go over here to the fence or to the weeds. My eyes didn't go over here to these other vague weeds. They went to the horse and to the sun. And they keep doing that. And the rest of this just frames it. And that is because contrast is king. Contrast, when you put the lightest things against the darkest things, that's what is visually most appealing. And that's why in every one of these silhouettes, I have my subject in the brightest parts of the sky. And therefore you get that contrast that's like eye candy. So we work on that during this workshop. And here's one more silhouette. So these reenactment actors from the 1800s are being photographed, and the rim light and the backlighting is kicking up light in the dust. And that's what gives all of their legs shape. Otherwise, like right about at their waist or their hips, it would all just be black. If I didn't have this dust back here, this would just be black like it is over here. And I would only have halves of people. So having that light or something that can reflect that light, like the backlighting, really helps when you're doing silhouettes. But we also do tips on posing, and we have horses and riders and off the horses and on the horses in different ways. So you can really capture some beautiful portraits in a somewhat candid environment, and also sometimes a structured environment, to just learn a little more about posing, because it can help you with your family portraits, you know, your grandkids, whoever you're photographing. It's nice to know a little bit more. And so we really try to teach this and capture some great images. This photo is not from me. It's from one of my instructors. And in a minute, I'm going to show you some from the participants to give you an idea of what's possible. And so one of the skills we also teach, which is a high key style, high key being very light and bright and airy, and the backgrounds go white, and it requires soft backlighting. So overcast days, and you photograph typically in an area where the subject is underexposed and the background is overcast and bright. So the sun is behind you. So there was a little bit of a sun here showing. It was very thin clouds here, but we were able to overexpose enough to see the detail in this black and white image and still show a little bit of that sunburst. Here's another high key. This shot was shot underneath an overhang at the ranch, like a little building. We were just inside the building. And behind here, believe it or not, is like fencing and all kinds of weird things. But this was backlit, and that stuff was pretty far away. And I was able to overexpose by 2.7 stops to just capture this cowboy in the shade, and then everything else blew out. So it was a sunny day. But if you use some of these techniques, you can really use them to create images you couldn't otherwise do. So because he was in shade, underexposed as can be, and the background was really bright, I was able to overexpose and capture this shot. And you can't even see the stuff in the background, which is awesome. Here's another vintage style, but overcast skies. We do have a little bit of sun, but not a ton. It's a little bit softly lit in the front, but I overexposed, and then I added a vintage kind of sepia tone to this, and I really happen to like it. So a tip for a takeaway today is next time you're in the overcast, find the sun, stare at it, and put your subject in front of it. Make sure it's overcast so it's not super bright, no shadows, no directional light. Put the person in front of the sun, and the sun is behind some clouds somewhere, or the person or the animal or what have you, and overexpose, starting at about 1 stop and working your way up to 3 stops, and you should be able to find a high key style shot in that if your lighting is correct. If you have any side light, front light, anything like that, it's not going to work. You really need diffused light, the sun behind the subject, you facing the subject in the sun, but the sun has clouds in front of it, and that will typically work and overexpose by 2 to 3 stops. And Gareth, I use autofocus most of the time. Very rarely would I use manual focus unless it's raining or snowing, because sometimes your focus will hit the snowflakes or raindrops before it hits the person or the subject. So usually I will be doing the autofocus. Here's another high key that I did in a vintage style. So again, by overexposing, I'm losing some of the detail here. She's lit from the back and a little bit from the side, not usually perfect for what I like for high key, but in this case, it worked. And this fence was there. And, if I angled myself just correctly, I can use that fence to bring me from the front to the back of the image. And then I have a little bit of a creamy colored vignette on this as well. But the high key is just such a great way to go, especially when we're fighting daylight. If you can find a shady area, it works, and then use bright daylight behind it. If you have overcast light, it's even better. These are techniques that we teach, but these are so important to have in your photography toolbox. If you don't know how to photograph in high key, you're losing moments that could be otherwise epic. So that's something I work on. I've touched on it here. Again, I'm happy to do another webinar if you want me to go deeper into high key, for example, in the future. More than happy to do that. But the request was to kind of just talk about cowboys and cowgirls and some of the techniques that we do. But also, these girls work so hard. I just talked to one of the cowgirls yesterday about our workshop, and she was in the middle of getting her commercial driver's license and also had tried to fix the solar system at the ranch. And she had it all torn apart and was trying to figure it out. I mean, these are not wimpy girls. These are girls that know what they're doing. And I love that they do that. The history of this and the lifestyle. I mean, there is no electricity at this ranch that we are at, and they make everything work. They have solar, they have generators, they, use wells and hauled water. They do a variety of things. They're fix-it-yourself kind of people. They know a lot of skills that the average person doesn't in order to do this lifestyle, and it doesn't pay much. I'm amazed how hard they work. But on the other hand, they're like, we get to be outdoors, we get to ride horses, we get to do the things that we love to do. As well as the things that we have to do in order to maintain the herd, maintain the horses. A lot of them do their own veterinary work and shoeing, the farrier work. They will do that as well, sometimes bringing outsiders in, but that's also a dying art, the art of shoeing horses. It's literally backbreaking work, and not many people are doing it anymore. So those who run ranches are learning more of these skills themselves. And if the ranch is very far off the grid, a lot of them are learning, good veterinary skills and other things to be able to maintain their herd. So this is not an easy lifestyle. It's picturesque as can be, but it is hard work, and it's fascinating to see what they do. You'd be amazed when you go to this ranch and see what's done from dawn till dusk every day. We also do low key lighting. So this is at night. So we use the darkness of night, bring in one light that the horse is facing here off to the side, and get this beautiful low key lighting. And that's another technique that I feel like photographers miss out on. And I try to teach these things because if you can do this with a horse or a person, you can do this with a flower, you can do this with an animal in the right light. It's all about finding the right light and the right backgrounds that make this stuff work. It's not rocket science, but we will place a light over here. The horse is facing it, and then the photographer is facing the side of the horse as shown here, and you can get this beautiful, gentle light. Here's another low key shot. One single light held, and it's a constant light, held off to the side by another assistant of mine. And then you get this beautiful contrast and soft lighting. So side lighting is critical and getting the right lighting. You don't want it too close. You don't want it too far. And again, this was done, we call it Cowboys in the dark. This was done at nighttime. You could do it with a black backdrop, but we had the whole night sky, so it worked perfectly. Here's another one. This guy was sitting at the campfire. This is a cowboy at the end of the day lighting up a cigarette, and it was just so much fun. And we actually improvised in this particular case. I used a rechargeable spotlight that's normally used for our kitchen area out in the ranch. And I took it and I set it down low, and then I put another light behind. See the rim light here, a little bit of the rim lighting here. I put it behind in order to create this shot. And it took a lot of puffs and a lot of time to get the smoke and get the light in here, but it worked. Here's another low-key shot with the light just behind and off to the left of this cowboy, but all you see is the rim of the hat and the nose and the wonderful beard that he has. This is Rick, and he's a wonderful photographer, or excuse me, ranch model, and actual cowboy. He's a champion in roping and herding, roping with cows. He has won more awards than you can count. But simple lighting. And this is what I feel like photographers miss when they think portraits. They think complicating lighting setups. They think flash, and that gets scary. I'm using one little lume cube, if you've heard of those. Just a little light about 1.5 inches wide by 1.5 inches tall. You could fit it in your pocket. And I'm holding it just behind the cowboy and off to the left here. And the photographer is standing facing the side of the cowboy, just like I'm showing here. You can get great stuff. You could try this at home. Go into a dark room, grab a plant of yours, go play with the lighting. Go grab, one stem of a flower, get one light off to the side. Maybe it's a little desk lamp, maybe it's a flashlight, maybe it's your iPhone, a flashlight. But these kinds of things are so simple, yet people get so afraid of portraits. And my goal is to say, hey, you can take some really cool things with really simple ingredients. This girl, she wanted, once she saw the guy getting the cigarette, she wanted to do it too. And I'm not an advocate for smoking, and she actually doesn't smoke. She just wanted to look. And so I processed this, and I did it a little bit vintage of a process, just to give you a little bit of an aesthetic that I really liked. But again, a simple light from behind and the spotlight here in the front and a little bit off to the side. And we had some really fun shots from this. So I'm just, again, hoping to inspire you that it doesn't have to be complicated, and it can work for photographers. And then here's one of my favorites. We try to incorporate something from a vintage movie. So this was Clint Eastwood and in the trilogy that he The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly that he was in. This is one of our cowboys, but I bought the serape and the hats, and we recreated a moment from that video or that movie. And I kind of did it in a little vintage style, and the aspect ratio is the exact same that was in the original movie. So I just kind of used that, and some unconventional cropping. You don't even see the eyes. So again, I hope this is giving you some inspiration. I'm going to wrap up here, but I hope this is giving you some inspiration. You don't even have to photograph the face. You can just do some fun detail work. But that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the lifestyle is like with cowboys. how hard they work, what kind of opportunities you can have if you come to any ranch in the US. There's, plenty of these types of photos to be had. But it really is storytelling at its best, and it's a history that's dying. And I love the fact that we can preserve that history through our photos and through the conversations that we have. And currently, Mason and I, my fiance and I are working on a documentary about cowboys, the cowboy lifestyle, cowgirls, and what's happening today with that lifestyle, both good and things that are fading away. But anyway, I am going to stop this presentation, and I want to take your questions real quickly, and then I'm going to have to run because I do have a hard stop with another appointment. But let me just come back here, and I will be glad to take any questions that you have or comments. And thank you for your time. I hope it was helpful.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed for the presentation. Some interesting, some very good, very nice and beautiful images there.
Thank you.
I particularly like some of those silhouettes and some of those cowboy images that we saw there at the end. So as we said before, if anybody has any questions, please type them into the chat facility. And,
Yes.
and Lisa will do her best to answer them for you. So
Definitely.
just one that I have, Lisa, which is apart from cowboys, apart from bears, what else do you do?
Well, I run my full-time business, which takes tons of time. But when I'm not doing that, oh my gosh, that's a really good question. So one of my favorite things to do is to hop in my pool here. It's 100 and let me look today, 108 degrees right now, Fahrenheit in Arizona. So that's a really fun thing for me to do. I also this year my mom is in assisted living, so I'm spending a lot more time caring for her. But if I had my druthers and I could do anything at any time, I mean, I truly do love photography. I also love bird watching, being out in nature, hanging out with my friends, my two cats that I adore. And I also train one of my cats. He does a lot of tricks. So I have fun teaching him new tricks. Yeah. And hanging out with my boyfriend, fiance now, but we're a pretty good team. He now works for my company too as a marketing director, and we just have a good time together. And when I'm not working, which is a whole bunch of the time, this is my full-time business and it gets more than my full-time attention. I really love relaxing and spending time with him. And occasionally we volunteer for different things as well in the area. And just keep it interesting. I always love for new things, new challenges, new ideas, new directions.
Okay, thank you. You'll see comments coming there from people who are being very complimentary and saying many thanks for the talk and how interesting
Thank
it
you.
was and how much they enjoyed it. So I would just echo all of those comments as well, and to thank you very, very much for your time, for being with us this evening.
You're very welcome. And again, this is a little deviation. Normally, I am highly into the education part of things, but I just tried to give you an idea of what bears and, cowboys are like and what you can do and a little bit of information about them. But if you ever do want me to go and dive deeper into techniques and so forth, I am more than happy to do that. Invite me back anytime. It'd be a pleasure to be a part of your group again. I appreciate everyone being here so much.
Thank you indeed. We definitely remember that.
Thank you so much. And I will put, if you guys have any questions or whatever, I have put my newsletter in there and then my email address. You can always email me after the fact as well, and I'll be still glad to answer them. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much indeed. And we
All
wish you
right.
the best. Take
Thank
care.
you. Take care, Paul. Thank you.
Bye, Mike. And
Bye-bye.
Congratulations, Lisa.
Thank you
Bye,
so
Paul.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.